Hey, my name is Mark Goldberg with UN Dispatch, the United Nations Affairs blog. And this is the second installment of UN Plaza, which is a weekly blogging heads series in which we're going to explore foreign policy and international relations through the prism of the UN and other international institutions. And I'm here with my favorite guest, Matthew Lee of
InnerCityPress.com.
InnerCityPress.com. He's blogging, as always, from the UN building itself. And today we're going to do a top 10. Top 10 UN stories of the year. We're going to do this sort of for the ESPN fans out there. We're going to do this Kornheiser-Wilbon style. We're going to have 5 minutes on each topic and cut each other off then and move right on down the list. So, Matthew, without further ado, topic number 1, Darfur.
Sure. I guess not to set it up, but in the middle of the year, there was a lot of hope of this hybrid force, 26,000 troops being sent into Darfur to put an end to what many people have called genocide there. At year end, it's looking that the force, at least at the beginning of 2008, is only going to involve 9,000 troops, most of them the African battalions that were already there under Amos. And so many people now question whether enough was done by the UN in general, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General in specific, to actually bring about a meaningful force in Darfur.
We should say that sort of when this force was envisaged.
Sure, there was a
it was meant to deploy by January 1st, 2009, and in its full, and that's certainly not going to happen. And there are a number of obstacles to deployment. The obstacle I point to most frequently is the government of Sudan itself, which has sort of hobbled the deployment of the mission at each and every opportunity. Right now, they're insisting that all troops deployed to UNAMID, the force there, must come from African countries. So they're denying critical units from the Nordic countries that have special expertise that Africans at this moment in time don't have. Additionally, the second big obstacle to deployment is the fact that member states with the capacity to deploy helicopters, to give helicopters to UNAMID, are not. And now, sort of, for want of 24 helicopters, the mission in Darfur might not even get off the ground. Forgive the pun.
It is. I mean, just factually, it is. They've made it clear that in terms of the responsibility for Darfur is going to be handed over from the African Union to the UN hybrid force on January 1. But it's true the troop numbers are very low. I mean, on the helicopters, at least the Secretary General is on record criticizing member states, and that would include the United States. Although some people think if the U.S. offered helicopters, that Sudan would turn them down. It's at least publicly they're saying that nobody has even offered helicopters. So that's a very for all the hoopla of people saying it's a genocide, we must stop it. No one has actually come forward with that. I've actually heard reporting here from the UN that the UN itself has 21 helicopters in Khartoum that it's not making enough noise about. That Sudan has said it would violate regulations to move them to Darfur, and rather than go public with the way in which they're getting rolled by the al-Bashir government, they've continued to say we're doing everything possible and task the member states, which of course they should ask them, but they should also be more transparent in terms of what forces they have there. And I guess the issue is yes, the al-Bashir government has at every turn invoked its sovereignty. But the U.S., the UN, the Secretariat really needs to think clearly through. They've allowed that as well, so it's a dynamic. It's an abusive relationship.
That I point to frequently is that member states of the UN itself does not have the capacity to punish Khartoum, and by the UN I mean the UN General Secretariat, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, or Jean-Marie Guéhenno, the head of peacekeeping. He himself does not have the ability to twist Khartoum's arm. The countries, it's the member states of the UN that have the ability to put pressure on the government of Khartoum, and so far they have not yet applied a sufficient amount of pressure necessary to break Khartoum's intransigence.
I want to add one point
force.
In terms of from the Sudanese side, and I'll try to do this. Obviously, most people would see this as just a pretextual argument on their part, but their concern is that what they say is that the UN is operating as a sort of a proxy for the United States, that by sending these peacekeeping missions, the goal is to separate their country into 5. with the South, now the West, and some other ones. And that's a pretext as that may be. I believe personally that the UN has made a mistake by awarding a large contract for Darfur to Lockheed Martin, the U.S.-based military contractor. They gave it to Lockheed Martin without any kind of competition. Whether or not it was legitimate, which many people think it wasn't legitimate, it just provided more ammunition for the Sudanese to say, this is just a way to, in this case now they're saying it's just a way to make money off us. So I think the UN could do a better job. Whether or not Sudan's arguments are legitimate, they resonate with some of the other developing countries and certainly in the Arab world. So it's sort of like, but rather than not give money to Lockheed Martin so they get criticized, they placate them by saying, okay, we won't even send troops from Nepal and Thailand. So I think that, you have to, blame is mostly in Khartoum, but there's been a kind of a ham-handed way the UN has dealt with it as well.
Yeah, at the same time, I think the most important thing right now is to expeditiously get this force on the ground. And it would seem to me that awarding these contracts, though you smell something fishy there, I could see a counter argument in which one would argue that we need to build these bases as soon as possible so we can get these troops.
Would you feel the same?
But of course, right now, these troops are not forthcoming.
Would you feel the same way if the companies? What's in a name? If it were Halliburton or Blackwater, you'd say the same thing. They should just take whoever, just that by any means necessary. Or are there some decisions that are so politically tone deaf that they're counterproductive? I guess is what I'm saying.
All right. Point.
Okay.
Point. Okay. Next. We're okay. Good. 1 minute. Next, Kosovo.
All right,
Matthew, you were sort of eyewitness to the developments in Kosovo.
There was a big
Security Council in the final 2 weeks of December.
There was a big
So what did you see? Actually, first let's set up. Let's give a broader context here. The sort of Kosovo, the government of Kosovo, is a newly elected government. Stated, ran on a platform of we are going to declare independence from Serbia, and Kosovo, as I think most viewers probably know, has essentially been a trustee state of the UN since the U.S. NATO-led bombing campaign against Serbia in 1999. So the current government of the Kosovar Albanian government has said that we are going to declare independence no matter what. And because they think that it's time that they now have grown wings and they deserve to be their own country. Serbia does not think this is necessarily the case, and Serbia's patron at the Security Council, Russia, certainly has been blocking this effort. And last March, the UN put forth this plan that would sort of grant a semi-autonomous status to Kosovo, but under heavily supervised supervision by international troops to protect the Serb minority in Kosovo. And this all came to a head this week in the Security Council. Take it away, Matthew.
Okay, no, definitely. There was it was actually for the first time in a while. It was there was a buzz around the Security Council and full of journalists, and there had been some dispute. Many people, basically, this was the end of a 120-day negotiation process that came to no agreement. Kosovo said it's going to unilaterally declare independence probably after late January, after the elections in Serbia, and the Serbs. So at the Security Council meeting, which was done behind closed doors, i.e. there was no, although you could talk to people on their way in and out, the agreement was that Kosovo could actually sit at the table, which in the past they haven't, but that the meeting would be closed. And Serbia and Russia, and they claim that that China, Indonesia, and the three African members of the council are on their side, although China and the Africans didn't speak to this effect afterwards. All said that more time should be given to talks, and their real argument is that the UN to date has never voted or stood by, has always said that territorial integrity is important, that it's based on countries keeping their current borders. And in this case, basically, most members of the Security Council and the sort of are saying, Serbs, you mistreated Kosovo, the people that you had there mostly fled after that, and now you lose the country. They're saying, and I think what makes it a very interesting story is that if the UN either stands by or the U.S. and the EU agree to that Kosovo will be independent, why not Western Sahara? Why not two breakaway provinces of Georgia? Why not? And so the issue, and I think here's the thing, is although Serbia obviously acted very badly, that's an understatement, in a way, they don't. I mean, they were talking. Most people sort of snickered and just said, what are you going to do when they declare independence? But if you, as a matter of kind of like international law, they kind of have a point. The other side is saying, oh, it's not a precedent, it's unique. And I think it actually is related to the Darfur issue in this way. The argument that it's unique is that Serbia let the UN run Kosovo since 1999. So they were sort of somehow on notice that they could lose that part of their country. But this is an argument that Sudan uses and says, why should they let the UN into Darfur? Which, some people would say that, it should be taken from them.
But I think the argument is similar thusly. It seems that Serbia lost its sort of ability to claim sovereignty over Kosovo once it treated its citizens there so poorly, and once it committed its ethnic cleansing campaign. I think one could argue that they no longer hold a legitimate claim to sovereignty over people that they essentially tried to exterminate.
But do you feel the same way about Chechnya, Tibet?
Well, let me finish. I think a similar argument could be made about Sudan's claims over Darfur as well. Of course, no one says that because because in order to get consent to get into Darfur, you need Khartoum's acquiescence to the peacekeeping force. One thing I'm curious to know how the United States responded in the second week of December in the Security Council, because the United States has been on record supporting Kosovo's independence. Did you see that come through?
Very much so. Ambassador Khalilzad spoke both before and after the meeting, very much saying, it has its own momentum. He stood. There was a sort of a real show of force of the not just the European members on the council, but other European countries standing and saying, basically, they're. I mean, there are some EU members that actually are not in favor of it. And one being Cyprus.
Cyprus and Spain, I think European countries for their own parochial reasons, with their own sort of breakaway republics.
But we say they're parochial, but I think they're precedential. I think basically countries that have their own, restive, particularly ethnic-based, restive subregions, don't like this, and for obvious reasons. I guess all I'm saying is that it's that there's something to that, and that in terms of like. I guess I wanted, and I'm sorry if I cut you off, but I guess I'm saying, do you feel the same, and I might feel it, but I'm asking you, do you feel the same about Russia and Chechnya, China and Tibet? The question is, if this is the principle.
I think there's a threshold of behavior that once crossed, you lose your claim to your claim over, to assert your sovereignty over
but
a
who
territory.
Sets the threshold?
Getting back to Kosovo, though, it seems though now that the Security Council is deadlocked, it's going to be kicked to the EU. But the EU is similarly deadlocked. Like, as you said before, the member states of the European Union are not cohered over a single strategy for Kosovo. So this is, I think, certainly an issue that one thought might be resolved this year, but is not going to be. Next, climate change.
Okay.
Climate change. So in the first 2 weeks of December, of course, there's the big conference in Bali. Everyone from Al Gore to Ban Ki-moon to Thomas Friedman was there. And strikingly, it seems at the very end of the conference, the United States was browbeaten away into backing off its hard-nosed opposition to emission reduction standards. And just a little background, the conference in Bali was meant as a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, which expires in 2012. And so the idea is behind this conference is to kickstart the negotiations now, because it's going to take at least a year to 2 years to negotiate this treaty, then another couple of years for the member states to actually ratify the treaty. So this is supposed to take over once the Kyoto Protocol ends in 2012. And it was pretty fascinating. We on UN Dispatch we had a special Java Blend blog that we called a Bali blog. We're getting updates from on the ground, and it seemed like it was just a fascinating, frustrating, but ultimately successful endeavor down there. Was that your sense?
I mean, I don't know. They certainly, and the current Secretary General has made this like his main issue. He's gone to the Antarctica. He's gone.
Yeah,
I think
we're going to talk about that later, though.
Here, I understand, but here they in that spirit they gave us. I mean, I've seen quotes from, for example, Al Gore saying, what was described as victory there is still far short of what's necessary.
Absolutely.
I'm sure you were, as I was bombarded by emails from environmental NGOs saying that even what was portrayed, everything sort of becomes theater. It's sort of like you end up with a clip of the guy from Papua New Guinea saying, "U.S., if you won't leave, get out of the room," and then the U.S. saying, "Okay, they'll consider it." Clearly the whole issue becomes, a lot of it rides on the U.S. presidential election. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, and that's stunning, actually. Part of the strategy, I guess, as it were, among the countries concerned about climate change was to get an outcome out of Bali that allowed for the United States to join the negotiations halfway through,
right?
Because they figure that they're, no matter if a Republican wins in 08 or if a Democrat wins in 08, no U.S. government could be quite as opposed to climate change, to emissions reduction standards as the current administration, which, to its credit, has done other good in terms of technology transfer issues, but in terms of the key mitigation issue of emission reduction standards, they're out. So they just want a process in which the United States, under a new administration, could join in the negotiations halfway through.
It seems like there's both big. I have something on the big picture. A lot of the fight is about what are the responsibilities of developing countries like China and India to both commit to caps and could, since many people say, for example, that coal is one of the major problems in this. They have a lot of coal. They're going to burn it one way or another. It's easy to say, well, we'll just have to invent this great technology of carbon capture and all this. It doesn't really exist yet. So I think that there's a lot of the one thing I'll say as a UN matter is that obviously climate change is a major issue. No one will dispute that. There's a lot of the whole UN has become things that they were already doing, providing vaccinations in Africa, very good things, are now all being presented as somehow related to climate change. I guess it's a matter of so there's a lot of, I think that there's skepticism because there's sort of too many people sort of jumping on the bandwagon. It's very different than people being skeptical that it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem, but it doesn't mean that every problem in the world, for example, they now define most of the humanitarian assistance they give, whether as being, climate change related, and some of these things like, earthquakes happened in the past. Maybe they're climate related. I don't know, but
similarly, in the middle of in the middle of December this year, the World Food Program put out a warning that food prices this year are at record high.
Yep.
And a lot of mainstream media picked up on this, but one of the reasons they cited was climate change, saying that there's an unusually low crop yield this year,
and that seems
due
like
to the farms getting not enough rain and all that issues, and it seems to be permeating I think everything that the UN's doing, and I think largely that has to do with the person of the Secretary General, which we will get to as a capstone to all this.
I thought you were going to say that there's also a side debate about whether the focus on the creation of biofuels takes land out of production for food and therefore is hurting the poor. And this is, some people thought it's just an issue of Venezuela raises it because it wants to sell oil, but actually it's an issue that resonates in a lot of places. In the UN's own special rapporteur on the right to food, John Ziegler, came to the UN headquarters during this year and said that biofuels are a crime against humanity. This was roundly meaning, okay. I think if you in some there are places where to do palm oil they're driving indigenous people off the land. There are some serious issues, but this is a side. This is another kind of you do have, and I think it goes back to China and India and coal. The UN has as a major mandate development of poorer countries. And then you do have the idea of what they shouldn't be emitting, or land that could be food should be for biofuels. I think to say that there's no you don't have to balance the two is false. I've asked the question a lot, and they say, oh, you can do both. You can have green development. You can't always have everything. And I think at some point, just within the UN, they're going to have to be more open about how are these two balanced, because there are times they are in conflict, right?
I completely agree.
Too bad.
Time. Myanmar.
Chop. I'll since you've been doing all the heavy lifting, I'll say that Myanmar, a historically, hermit-like repressive country. Sorry, just in recent years at least, it flared up. I mean, it's been there's been obviously people have called for the freeing of Aung San Suu Kyi, the democratically elected leader who has been under house arrest for years. But suddenly, in this year, there came on television screens all over the world the image of monks, saffron-robed monks marching in the streets of Rangoon and being roundly, beaten and shot by the military government of Myanmar.
Yeah.
And although it was perceived, this is probably an overly opinionated summary, but although it was perceived that, in this case, China, for example, has earlier in the year, China and I believe South Africa, but China with its veto, had kept the issue of Myanmar off the Security Council agenda because they say it's an internal problem of one country. It's also in their region. They really don't want the whole world talking about it. After the monks, protested, which was really it began as an economically based protest. Then it became a protest against monks getting killed.
Yeah.
Even China relented, and it was put on the Security Council agenda. There were meetings about it.
Yeah.
A guy called Ibrahim Gambari, a long-time UN used to be he's in Nigeria. He was Nigeria's ambassador to the UN. Then he became a UN diplomat. Has been sent and has made travel to the country. Met with the generals.
First time a UN official had been there in a UN official of his stature.
I mean the UN has programs in Myanmar. In fact, in the midst of this, the UN's head of the UN development program was thrown out for talking about problems in the country. But I think that the unique visit was this other guy called Pinheiro, who's the special rapporteur on human rights in Myanmar.
On human rights,
He's had a mandate to report on it. It's never been allowed in the country. And I think so. There was a moment. I guess I want to find a way to make this a more provocative question. But there was a moment where it seemed like because the government had cracked down on television, suddenly everything was moving. There's a perception, at least here at the UN, that's now the momentum seems to be petering out, i.e. I think one of the reasons was the UN, in fact, some people say Gambari had to sort of be less than critical of the military government as a cost of getting in, but if he's so uncritical, does it dissipate the momentum, at least of the UN actually changing things on the ground?
If my memory serves me correctly, Gambari was able to coordinate after it seemed like his mission would be a failure there, that he wouldn't be able to meet the junta leader.
Yep.
That in the end he was actually able to meet with the leader and be an intermediary between the democracy movement and the junta leader. And at the end, Aung San Suu was let out of her house arrest, and her party was sort of given minimal rights, or at least more rights than they had been. And then
what happened after that was
10 years.
They had been promised sort of a place at the table during this drafting of a constitution, and that's now been thrown out. That's why I'm saying it's not to be negative. Clearly, there was something going on. Many people, it's sort of there was something afoot. Clearly, some of the momentum has been lost.
Yeah.
Now, Myanmar claims that this is a U.S.-funded, just like the Saffron Revolution.
Yeah.
You do have, this is totally an aside, but like monks versus an armed military regime is a hard battle to win.
Yeah. Yeah.
And meanwhile, not just you have China and India doing business there, but you have major, European, America, but Total Oil comes to mind, where there are many Europe-based companies that do business directly with the junta, and they pay the license fee directly to them. So they're not having any problems buying weapons. I know there's a move afoot in the U.S. Congress to impose some type of an arms embargo on Myanmar, but they're able to they have their supporters. So it's a difficult. I will say, I think that there were people that were. There was a moment where it really seemed like, wow, and I'm not. It's not to be hopeful for 2008. It's just I will say, having spoken directly with Mr. Gambari about it and seen him sort of, it's at least the hope for speed has now gone by the roadside.
Yeah. One hopes it'll be brought up in the Security Council in 2008. At least now it's on the it's on the radar. So now moving on to a favorite of yours, Matthew, some muckraking that you've done at the UN this year. It's number 5 in our countdown of 10.
Right.
So where to start, Matthew? This is your area.
No. I'd say that there's a I mean, just recently at year's end, there was a it's been announced that the Procurement Task Force, which is a UN body set up to look into procurement, fraud and corruption, has found $600 million of contracts affected by fraud. The stories given were actually relatively kind of low-hanging fruit, sort of like local procurement officers in the Congo who solicited, a free lease of a Mercedes-Benz. I think that one thing that I've tried to spend the year doing is looking at the issue of corruption in the and it's not just corruption in the UN. I think one reason it's not to be anti-UN. It's that when you create they have a budget of it's 5 million secretariat, 5 million outside, but two, there's a lack of legal accountability. Meaning there are UN people except really an extremist can't be brought to court. There's a real lack of transparency. So it's a setup for people steering contracts. And one of the things that I've tried that at least at year end, I mentioned in connection with Darfur, but it's usually perceived as the U.S. trying to force the corrupt UN to clean itself up. But in fact, at least in the case of this Lockheed contract, the UN official who first wrote a letter saying they've got to get it is an American head of Department of Field Support, Jane Hall Lute, who people may or may not know. Her husband is a General Lute. Is actually a Bush administration advisor on Afghanistan and Iraq. And this is it's something where the usual machinery to look into corruption at the UN has been hard-pressed to do it, because most of that machinery is set up at the U.S. instigation. Go ahead.
I think that the U.S. has been pressing, I think, the hardest among, and I think rightfully so, for more transparency. I think that the problem, though, is more of almost a structural one, in that you said, individual sort of non-military members of peacekeeping operations, civilian staff, have this almost ambiguous legal status. They are likely, if they're sort of found to have committed a crime, it's unlikely that they'll be prosecuted in the country in which they're serving, principally because these countries often don't have functioning judiciaries. And then the question becomes, do they, what the UN, the most the UN can do is fire these individuals and repatriate them, and then it's a crapshoot as to whether or not their home countries will prosecute them.
No, you're
and the thing is, I'd be hard pressed to think that the United States would want some sort of international legal regime where all citizens are under the same legal jurisdiction in these cases. So I think there has been moves. I think Secretary General Kofi Annan, to his credit, instigated this sort of process to look at how to ensure accountability among civilian staff on peacekeeping missions, and what their recommendation was to have an international agreement among member states that if your nationals are going to serve on a mission, they have to fall under so-and-so jurisdiction. And that's, I think, the closest we're going to come. It's sad to say, but it's almost like it's a trade-off in a way. You need people on the mission, but and there are going to be a certain number of people who are not going to uphold the ideals and the values of the UN. And it's sad to say, but in a bureaucracy as large as the UN, it's bound to happen. And it's almost like the ability to prosecute these people in a court is difficult, but it's not impossible, and certainly there's room for improvement. But I think the UN is in this sort of is in a process of evaluating itself, and I think that's I just want to say that I think that what separates the UN from other bureaucracies of its size, is that it does have an ability to sort of take a look at itself and to reform. I think a bit more quickly than many other institutions.
The only thing is, I would distinguish this issue of peacekeepers and even civilian staff, acting bad in the field, whether it's buying teenage sex for $1 or other issues, or even shooting people. The issue of contracting fraud really is taking place mostly at the headquarters. That's where the big hand contracts are signed. And I think I don't want to only focus on this Lockheed Martin one, but I've seen other ones of China. One of the issues that you have is I think there's the big countries, they put in money to the UN, sure, but they're also getting the money out, and they make sure they are. It's not in necessarily a competitive process. And I think that although you're talking about the ability of the UN to reform itself, and I'm all for that, I think, as with the Security Council and the veto power, same thing on procurement, where the country that was pushing to get the money is one of the big five or a major donor, you don't see the ability for the UN to say this is a problem. You see a lot of focus on relatively small shenanigans, And I think and it's led to, this has actually led, in this Lockheed Martin thing, just so you know, as a series of documents were released, what happened was the UN's defense, they said, well, we had to do this contract without competition because there was a Security Council resolution at the end of July saying we had to be in Darfur by the end of the year, we had to move fast. And then somebody leaked a letter, which was put under my door one day, which shows that back in April of 2007, Jane Hall Lute was saying, let's go sole source, i.e. before the Security Council resolution. And in fact, there's a letter from all the way back in late 2006 from Condoleezza Rice to then Kofi Annan saying, you guys have to take over this contract. So there was time to put it out to bid. There is no question. And it wasn't put out to bid, I think, because you tell me. I mean, the U.S. is the major donor. This is a major company. And they gave it to them. And let's say that's not true. The problem is, once this was raised, not just by journalists, but by member states in the Fifth Committee, whatever, Egypt, Angola, for whatever the reasons.
For our viewers' sake, the Fifth Committee is the budgetary committee of the UN.
Exactly. So they had to review this even after the fact. They raised a number of questions, and to date, none of them have been publicly answered. And I've asked Ban Ki-moon himself. He comes to like a stakeout area with the press. I've asked him about the contract. He said, well, we had to do it, but we're going to be entirely transparent. And it's not necessarily, he has many things to work on, right? He flew, there was the many of the things we're still going to talk about. But the commitment to be transparent about how they were selected, how much they've been paid to date, none of it has actually been carried out. There's just been defensiveness at all levels. I asked on camera that this number 2 of peacekeeping, please explain when the decision was made to go with Lockheed Martin. And he said, I can't answer that. You have to ask Department of Field Support, which is like totally related. It's just spun off from them. So it's a real, I have to just say, and again, I'm not complaining. I'm happy. I'm here. I'm going to keep
I guess,
pursuing
Matthew,
it, but there's a real problem.
In the new year, Matthew, I think we can be sure that you'll keep
right. No, I didn't mean that facetiously.
Moving on to Iraq.
Sure.
When Ban Ki-moon became Secretary General, one thought that there were noises, at least, that the UN might play a more expanded political role in Iraq. Of course, in 2003, the UN suffered its greatest loss to date when 22 people, including the head of mission there, Sergio Varela de Mello, was killed in a bombing there. And since then, the United Nations has had to scale back its political operation in Iraq, although they did come back, and the UN is largely responsible for creating the elections of 2005. This was sort of Lakhdar Brahimi was able to be an interlocutor between Sistani, who's the cleric running the Shia at the time when they're more unified than they are now, and the United States, and was able to forge this compromise to them. And that was, the Purple Finger moment, if you'll recall, was, I think, largely orchestrated by Brahimi and the UN. And now the operation is small, and it might grow bigger.
There's been
and sort of, I think, somewhat there's a bit of consternation, as you've said before, among the UN staff itself, because it's a dangerous place, and it's on one hand they feel they might have a duty there, on the other hand they'll be putting their lives at risk.
But I think that I agree with all of that. I would add one thing where I think that there's also and among not just UN staff, but you could add some countries, they see it as a bit too much of the U.S. has run into has obviously, it's an understatement, run into problems in Iraq and would like to somehow hand it off to the UN and to the current Secretary General, who was largely put in and coronated by the U.S., being very fast to sort of either on the one hand to make the UN relevant by taking on this most serious problem, or on the other hand, as it clearly is something that the Bush administration would like, is to see the UN become larger. And so the Secretary General has proposed to build a new headquarters in Baghdad at a cost of $180 million, has proposed to jack up the level of staffing. That's really run into some opposition within the UN itself, including in the previously mentioned budgetary committee, where that's not passing. And in part, it's not just to save money. It's, I think there's a skepticism, and we can talk about this. That there is in the U.S. people think the UN is this anti-U.S. U.S. hotbed of anti-Semitism and corruption, but there is, it seems, a perception elsewhere in the world that in many cases the UN is a lapdog for the U.S., France, and others. And in part, his proposal on Iraq falls into that.
Yeah, no, I think that actually shocks people to hear. I'm reminded that most of the world for a long time thought Kofi Annan was sort of America's too pro-American at the UN. It seems to me though at least that the UN is going to be involved in Iraq one way or another. Right now, principally the UN and its agencies like the UN Commission on Refugees and Human Rights and UNICEF is really the only organization in the world that's taking care of the Iraq refugee problem. Right now there are 2.2 million Iraqis living in Syria and Jordan.
That's why I'd say it's mostly Syria that's taking care of them. But.
Mostly Syria. And these refugees are being cared for by the UN and its agencies. Though these agencies still have to go around begging member states to pay them to deal with this crisis. And it's something that they're going to be stuck with for a long time. And now, sadly, we've heard recently of refugee flows back from Syria to Iraq. But that's not because things are getting better in Iraq. It's because the refugees who are largely middle class have essentially exhausted their resources. They can no longer sort of pay rent, and which has incidentally skyrocketed around Damascus because of this influx of refugees. That they can no longer support themselves in this foreign country, so they reluctantly have to board buses and head back into the war zone. And it seems like it's something that for the foreseeable future, the UN and its agencies are going to have to deal with for a very long time.
We could also throw in that the U.S., for example, has been very stingy, might be the word, in terms of giving refuge. Obviously, this is not the solution for 2 million people, but I think we're talking really in the thousands that they've taken, not tens of thousands. And I know there's currently a story in England that even people that did translation for them in Basra have not been allowed to go to England, and many of them are in fact killed for having collaborated with England. So it's I think in Syria, it's one of the reasons people are also going back is that Syria has now started charging a fee to remain.
Okay.
And whether some people said that that's wrong, but the world community should have exactly. This is a global problem, right?
And the UNICEF has put out these appeals to help build like schools and hospitals to deal with these this massive influx.
No, exactly.
Of
and I think just to be clear, it's not being kind of mean spirited. I would very much, and I think even the critics here distinguish between the UN's humanitarian agencies being involved in Iraq. And the Ban Ki-moon's proposal is really to become a player in the politics, to set up. It's a different thing than what's being done currently by the humanitarian agencies. And I think that's what people say.
And you wonder, though, at least for me, if not the UN to play this sort of almost neutral role to try to negotiate among the competing political factions within Iraq, but also to bring the region together. If not the UN to do that, then
definitely. But I think the issue
that's the problem.
At least as I understand it from the critics here, the issue is has the current UN, not the current Ban Ki-moon UN, established enough its independence from the United States to be seen as a credible broker. And I think to do that, you sometimes have to actually, openly disagree with the U.S. You know what I mean? You have
and this also speaks to how if the UN were to play this goal, how much political space would the United States give the UN to do this? If the UN had one priority and the U.S. had another, sort of, who would win that argument? I think that's. It's something I'm ripping off James Traub, who wrote an excellent article for the Stanley Foundation, sort of gaming out what might be a greater political role for the UN in Iraq. Sort of moving along to a more recent tragedy was the bombing in Algeria, which killed 17 UN staffers, an Al-Qaeda associated group. Had twin bombings in Algiers in the middle of December, and killed killed 17 staff members and scores others. And I'm wondering, Matthew, what was your reaction like inside the building?
No, I mean people were
inside the UN.
Sure, no, absolutely. People were shocked, and this was when Ban Ki-moon was actually in Bali, so there was a sort of some people were like, when's he going to go there? But he did on his way back stop there. And then, well, I guess maybe this is I saw this with my own eyes. He came to from the airport to to a meeting of staff in a jam-packed lobby, and he had a sort of half-singed flag from Algiers. But the one thing he said, and I think this I mean, obviously it's a tragedy, but he said we have to do, and it's written by his speechwriters, but he must believe it. He said it. He said we have to do a better job of explaining what the UN does to people, including explaining that we're not just there for a few countries, but we're there to remove mines. And it was a real. I thought it was a good, very, very well thought out paragraph. And the reference in terms of explaining to people that we're not there for a few countries is to a statement that I think Al Qaeda in the Maghreb put out. Not to give them, they're terrorists. They said, the UN was targeted because they're slaves of the U.S. and France. And that's okay. They're terrorists, so what they did is condemnable. But I was actually just objectively interested that I didn't think that Ban Ki-moon would even sort of like dignify that critique. He would just say, these guys are terrible, and we have to, we're doing God's work. But he said we have to do a better job explaining why we're there, and I agree with that. I think that the UN, and it goes beyond just trying to not just say you're not a lapdog, but to show it. But also to be more forthright. I mean, it's an issue that I don't know if it fits in the top 10, but issues have come up. Let's say it happens in Myanmar. Like there are places where the UN, even where it's doing great humanitarian work, where it's challenged by a government. The government of Sri Lanka has told UN humanitarian workers that they shouldn't have gone to a commemoration of dead, Action contre la faim humanitarian workers, and they shouldn't never talk to the Tamil Tigers, and they shouldn't do business in parts of the country. And rather than confront that and say we're the UN, we deal with everybody, they've sort of accepted it. With the argument to journalists that we have to put up with this, the only way we're in the country. And I've decided whether this is what Mr. Ban meant or not. That seems to be saying that the UN should err on the side of being vocal and saying this is what we're about. These are our principles. We're humanitarians. We're here for this reason. Don't push us. I don't know. I
mean, at least to me, this latest attack on the UN is the sort of this idea of neutrality that the UN is above being targeted was pierced pretty sharply with the bombing in Iraq in 2003, and that was a big shock to the system. And then recently, last summer, there was a suicide bombing against peacekeepers in Lebanon. A car bomb. There are 6 Spanish peacekeepers that were killed when someone drove a car laden with bombs into their convoy. And now this attack on Algeria, in Algeria, is simply like the latest manifestation of what I think might be a very troubling trend, in that the UN is no longer seen as being above dispute, which is, I don't think it's any fault of the UN. It's obviously a tactic that the terrorists are seeking to use to further their political agenda, but it's
I think we have to find a way to talk.
Sad comment on the inhumanity of the terrorists that they would do such.
But I think we have to find we have to find a way to talk about that where it's not by saying even by it goes without saying that to kill blow up the peacekeepers and to explode the UNDP building in Algiers is bad. So, but it's not to blame the victim, to say there's steps that the UN might want to take to establish its independence. Do you see what I'm saying?
Sure.
That doesn't mean in response to a terrorist bombing or anything like that. But I think if we just say,
well, listen, terrorist bombing is part of a political strategy, right? It's not because they're just merciless, hateful creatures, which certainly they are. Certainly the murderers of the 17 UN workers were. But it's part of a political agenda, and they seem to think that targeting the UN and UN personnel is a way to advance their political agenda.
Let's go back to maybe this may, and I'm sad. One of the UN leaks of the year, which was this guy called Alvaro de Soto, who's a longtime UN diplomat involved in what they call the Quartet, dealing with Middle East problems. And at the end of all of his time on this, being the UN representative on this, he, in his final memo that was never supposed to come out, but did, said that the UN's position, not the Security Council's, but the Secretariat's position, has been far too close to the U.S. and has undermined the credibility. And this guy's not a terrorist.
Sorry, wait, let me interrupt you, because he was speaking. He was the representative to the Quartet,
correct?
Which was dealing with the Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestine-Israel conflict. and he was the UN's guy at the. He was the UN's representative, the quartet being the EU, the US, Russia, and the UN. Yep. And his critique was that, as you said, that among the quartet, the UN's position was too close to the American position, and which was unhelpful because, if you recall, in 2005, 2006, Hamas was elected. Won elections in Palestine. And the question was whether or not the U.S. and donor countries to Palestine should cut off their funds. And he recalls the fact that he was browbeat, and the UN was browbeat by representatives of the Bush administration to, in fact, pursue the strategy of just simply cutting off aid to the Palestinian territories, which he found to be counterproductive, and which I think reasonable people might be able, would agree that in fact was counterproductive.
But I think his frustration was more than just that one decision. I mean, it's a long memo, and I guess I'm just trying to cite to something that's not written by a car bomber. You know what I mean? Yeah. That says that this is something that's out there, and I think just because in the U, I mean, I think one of the reasons that politically both Kofi Annan and now Ban Ki-moon are very careful about taking public positions that the U.S. doesn't like is because there's already this perception probably wrongly, but there's a perception in the U.S. that the UN is so anti-U.S. that they want to be, for example, after the election of Hamas, like somebody in the UN probably should have openly met with them. They were elected. But they would never do that, mostly because of the U.S. reaction. Right. But then the perception in the Middle East is like the UN's a bunch of hacks. That's the problem. Not everywhere. I don't mean to oversimplify. But I think, you know what I mean? They're caught between a rock and a hard place, but they've chosen which rock to cling to. In many cases.
Lee, the blame America first.
No, isn't it? No, I mean.
No, I know. I'm just.
No, I think you have to have a bipolar world. Maybe in the past you had the U.S. and the Soviet. If the UN doesn't have an army, but if it's going to be even a moral counterpoint to the U.S., it has to be a bit more independent, and that's probably good for the U.S.
Next topic, we got to move on. Okay. We've developed. Okay, non-proliferation was our next topic.
This one is close to your heart, so I'm at least the setup is all yours, and I know you're going to say it was a great year for non-proliferation. Are you not?
It was.
Okay.
It was.
I'm not.
Looking back a year ago, last December 2006, the Security Council imposed sanctions on North Korea. Shortly thereafter, North Korea returned to the six-party talks. Shortly thereafter, the Bush administration in the North and Pyongyang announced this deal in which the North would shut down their reactor at Pyongyang, open up North Korea to IAEA inspectors, and the Pyongyang facility to IAEA inspectors, and in exchange for food aid and other fuel aid to the North, as well as some thawing of the diplomatic relations. And now, ironically, at least to me, this was essentially the position prior to 2002, when the Bush administration and North Korea withdrew from the agreed framework that the Clinton administration had set up. And so at least on the North Korea front, the progress is in the right direction. And similarly in Iran, we have obviously the bombshell news of the National Intelligence Estimate confirming what the International Atomic Energy Agency had been saying for years, namely that Iran does not. Iran has no. There's no evidence that Iran has a active nuclear weapons program. And and so that seems to have taken the wind out of the sails of folks who've been calling for a third round of sanctions against Iran, which now seem to be stalled.
Totally, no, that is stalled.
And actually, it was shocking to me when you read this NIE report. They're explaining why is it that that Tehran had decided to back off from its program, and they identified international pressure as being actually able to convince Tehran that they had more to gain from not pursuing a nuclear weapons program than going ahead with it. And this, at least to me, seems to seriously detract from folks who argue that the UN and the Security Council is completely irrelevant when it comes to leveraging the behavior of rogue regimes like Iran, and to me it just seems that the cause, people who have been calling for war, and calling for perhaps a kinetic solution, as they say, to the Iranian nuclear problem, now have less of a credible case to make.
Oh, definitely. I mean, exactly. I don't actually. The only thing is, I would just note, first of all, and I don't agree with them, but the real red meat guys would say that Iran stopped in 2003 because the U.S. had invaded Iraq. I mean, I've heard that argument. I don't think we'll ever know until you find the internal memo. Was it UN, targeted sanctions, or was it the invasion of a neighbor? I don't think we know.
It's not just people who said that. A person who said that was John Bolton, who wrote
there are more than him that say that. That's all.
He said that specifically, actually, in a Washington Post op-ed that came out right after the NIE report came out. And to this, I just point out that that the NIE identifies that in the fall of 2003 is when the regime in Tehran decided to abandon their weapons program. And I'm thinking what else happened in the fall of 2003? That's when the International Atomic Energy Agency's Board of Governors decided to demand that Iran open itself up to inspections, and that demand that Iran halt its program or face unmentioned consequences. So there seems to be, at least if you're looking at when the action happened, a direct correlation between the IAEA Board of Governors declaration on Iran's nuclear program and Iran's decision to abandon its nuclear weapons program. I mean, it seems to be a more proximate cause and effect than the invasion of Iraq, which I don't want to say it's negligible. It's certainly
exactly.
affected the calculus of the regime, but
and I literally just say this factually. I don't have a. I think on North Korea, what some people would say, and again, not to back up any counter strategy, just that in a way the seizure of North Korea funds in this bank in Macau, which ended up actually slowing down the deal after it was signed, because the U.S. had promised they'd get this money back, and they couldn't get it back. But that, in fact, that seemed to have really, it was only $25 million, but I guess it's hard currency, it's cold cash. This caused a lot of, whether in fact, it was really consistent with international law. I mean, there was a lot of kind of strange issues in the freezing of that money, and that was a unilateral decision. That wasn't a UN decision. That was the U.S. declared a bank, a money laundering concern, took the money, and then had to kind of cook the books to get it returned. But so I guess it's just I think that let's just say I can't disagree with you that in terms of those two, it's been a good year for disarmament.
Yeah. Well, non-proliferation disarmament, I think, is a different story.
Okay. No, but all right.
Yeah. Peacekeeping. That's next on your list. That's next
on my list. It is.
All right.
It's so a growing. We can put it in the sort of the big picture is that the year began with the UN with more peacekeepers deployed than ever before, and even with the slowdown in the Darfur deployment, it has ended with an even greater deployment. And so it's become, when he came in, Ban Ki-moon said, this is a major task, is to somehow, modernize the UN's ability to deploy these missions. Because obviously if the UN is about, maintaining international peace and security, and the Security Council votes to send troops, they've got to run them. So it's been, they're scattered all, there's still, peacekeeping missions and observer missions in observer missions in Abkhazia, Georgia, and Cyprus, and various places. But most of them are in Africa.
So I was actually going to say, so there are 18 peacekeeping missions in the world right now. The 19th would be Darfur. And over 75% of all peacekeepers are in Africa, and that number is only going to swell in the next year or 2 years because of this sort of crisis that are emerging throughout the greater Horn of Africa, from Chad to the Central African Republic to Darfur to southern Sudan, where there are currently 10,000 peacekeepers, to along the Ethiopian-Eritrean border, and perhaps even to Somalia. So you have this whole sort of region that's erupting, and the international community is looking to the UN to send peacekeepers to solve the problem. The problem with that is that at least in my opinion, the international community is not providing the UN with the commensurate support to maintain such a robust peacekeeping operation. There are something like 400 to 500 people at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations in the UN itself, supporting over 100,000 people in the field, and this is just unsustainable unless countries like the United States, particularly, which funds 27% of the peacekeeping budget, but is constantly running arrears, unless they start to fund the UN commensurate with what they expect the UN peacekeeping to do, unless other countries do as well. The recipe could be pretty dangerous, I think.
No, I don't disagree.
It seems
they should
like
have more funds.
Yeah.
I guess that I've noticed a couple of things. One is that you'd mentioned maybe even Somalia. I mean, I think many UN officials have said this is one either they've often actually contrasted Darfur and said it's a greater humanitarian tragedy right now, and it's certainly a place where war is actively displacing hundreds of thousands of people, on a monthly or weekly basis. In the south central part of the country, and that's something where there's actually kind of an interesting dynamic in terms of what peacekeeping is, where this was set off by the Islamic courts. The country's been in chaos now for well over 10 years, all the way back to Black Hawk Down. I mean, this has gone through various iterations, but. I think it's a real kind of a low point for various UN sides of the UN. One, the Security Council, they've really done very little. This time last year, almost exactly 12 months ago, Ethiopian troops, without any kind of authorization from the UN, rolled across the border and took over Mogadishu. They're still there. They're still by far and away the largest. It's an occupation basically. Now maybe it's one that the world sort of acquiesced in, but nobody ever said. I mean, let's contrast it to Iraq. Nobody ever said, this is okay, but the U.S. certainly supports it, mostly because the people routed were these Islamic courts. They were Islamic, they're fundamentalists. Some people felt that they had actually, had brought some stability to the country. Anyway, they were driven out, but they have a lot of support, and so they're still around. They're shooting it. And so there's been a call. It's actually interesting in this case where there's been a call even from the African Union saying there needs to be either a hybrid force or UN funding for AMIS and AMISOM. And there's been the UN has done nothing, absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it's been falling on deaf ears. Somalia is not. Sadly, I think not. On the priority of most powerful member states like the U.S. or Japan or other.
But there's something where Ban Ki-moon has a potential to use a bully pulpit. I mean, sadly, the dynamic has been the Security Council, maybe just to absolve itself, called on the Secretariat to send an assessment mission, to send a peacekeeping mission, and Mr. Ban Ki-moon came back with a report saying too dangerous to send an assessment mission, and they've sort of chided him for that. And again, maybe it is really literally too dangerous for whatever an assessment mission would look like to go there. But it is so he hasn't sort of. I guess I'd say is there's been the I guess it may be that the bully pulpit is it's not taking a leadership position. It's like
Well, it's one.
Go ahead.
I just think that it would take a member state to put all its diplomatic weight into forging a solution. And frankly, it may come from the Nordic countries, which have that way above their weight in terms of foreign aid, and which actually had at least a pretty heavy presence along the Ethiopian-Eritrean border for a while. But like you said, right now the Ethiopians are still in Somalia. Somalians and Ethiopians don't have there's no love lost. I think
absolutely
the presence of foreign troops is inspiring an insurgency, and it's the only country in the world without a government right now, and it's in desperate need of some sort of intervention. But the problem is that there's no one's willing to step up and do it.
But I mean, again, it actually does have a government. It's just a government that's actually acting.
The government,
it was put in power by the Ethiopian invasion. It's called the Transitional Federal Government. Many of its officials are on record saying things like, "Well, if civilians provide support to the Islamic courts, they too should be targeted." There's really some outrageous stuff going on. I think I covered pretty closely, and there seems to be a big reticence. And I don't mean to. I'm just saying it to sort of so we can do it in the 5 minutes. That there's been a real reticence on the part of the UN Secretary and its organs to kind of hold the transitional federal government to task, and I believe in it. I believe it's because their opponents are these Islamic fundamentalists, which nobody really wants to support them. But so they feel that being overly critical of some really pretty outrageous statements by the titular government would somehow be providing succor to these Islamic fundamentalists.
Yeah.
But a government has to be held to a different. It's not. Certainly rebels and governments are, the law of war is the law of war, but when something that's a government that's being supported, that the UN recognizes and has, UNDP has helped fund the troops that are targeting civilians.
That's the UN Development Program for those less in the know. But at least to me it seems that the just because of sort of the demands on peacekeeping right now, it seems that it's just it's sad, but it seems that on the totem pole of priorities, sadly Somalia it's not as high. They're having trouble getting 24 helicopters for Darfur, which is everyone knows what Darfur is all about. And it seems to me if they're having that much trouble getting such few equipment for such a big issue, that something like Somalia, sadly, is just not even sort of in the back of people's minds. Which is I think terribly tragic.
One thing just on peacekeeping, I think feel somehow we'd be remiss. The largest current peacekeeping mission of the UN is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and it's been it's over 20,000 troops. They've been there for some time.
Yeah.
I have to say again, not to be there was an election held this year.
Sorry, but before you go, let's provide a little background.
Okay, sure.
It's
a country that was absolutely.
From 1998 to 2002, the DRC, as it's called, was sort of the locus of what they call sort of Africa's first world war. It's surrounded by something like 9 to 11 countries, and each country and each group within the DRC just tried to get a piece of the pie as the Mugabe regime, the Kabila regime fell, and it turned into a brutal civil war. Something like 2 million people were killed, and sort of the UN sort of peacekeepers were called in. The largest peacekeeping operation in the world was largely able to stop the war in most of the country. However, the conflict and the remnants of conflict still exist brutally in the eastern part of the country, in this region called Ituri and Kivu. And today, the fighting still rages on. The UN has actually adopted some more aggressive tactics. The UN, for the first time, is actually proactively targeting people that are targeting civilians, as opposed to simply inserting themselves between warring factions, which is kind of controversial.
I think what's controversial right now these days is that since there was an election held this year, so that's all to the good. Even though there were many, there's critiques that can be made of the election. That was certainly a step forward.
I say that just interrupt real quick. That election was sort of the most stunning logistical feat, I think, in the history of elections. They had people get ballots to canoes. They had like an 80% participation rate, and it was judged as a free and fair election after a country had been ravaged by war for such a long time. But as you said that the war still rages on, certainly in the east. And sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. That's I guess all I did, because this is a current and it's a question for UN peacekeeping, is that it's not so much. It sounds good if you say the UN has adopted this mandate of stopping people from killing civilians by themselves shooting. But what it's really done is to say we now no longer make policy decisions. We support the government in what it wants to do. And the problem is, even though it is the Kabila government in power now, even though
Kabila, not the same Kabila that was the Kabila's son.
They were elected. They've chosen, the current fight is he's chosen to try to militarily eliminate the rebel forces of a guy called General Nkunda, who's ethnically a Tutsi from Rwanda, who claims that his rebel force is exists and will continue to exist in order to defend Tutsis from Rwanda, Tutsis from Hutus, which was the dynamic in the Rwandan genocide. It may sound complex, but the government has decided wisely or not to target this Tutsi group rather than the Hutu rebels that he says he's fighting. And the UN has sort of just fallen in behind the government and is acting, is transporting troops to the battlefield, transporting their ammo. And the thing is that the government troops have been losing, and civilians have been getting killed by both sides, including by the government. And so people, even on the Security Council recently, have called UN peacekeeping. Not the head guy, Gaino, was away. The number 2 guy is called Edgar Millay, called him in and said, what are you doing? Because the announcements that come out now of civilians being displaced, they're actually being displaced by the government incursion, which is UN supported. So again, it's not saying, I actually spoke to Mr. Millay, and I don't know if I can say all of what he said. He seemed to indicate where, if this government initiative had been successful, no one would be criticizing the UN peacekeeping now. But since it wasn't successful, there's a lot of second guessing. But it is, I think, when the UN decides to actively so clearly it depends. Somebody has to decide, is this a legitimate conflict where the UN should be supporting negotiations, or is it a one-sided affair where it's fair to actually provide military support to one side? That's what the UN did.
Well, you say, it's not like the fighting. There aren't just two sides fighting there. There are a number of.
Oh, sure, but right now the actual current fight in North Kivu is government versus forces of General Nkunda. Sad thing is that Nkunda's forces are winning. And most people say it's because the Congolese army is so disorganized, it's known for human rights violations. But again, it goes back to a question. It's not a slam dunk. I'm not saying like the UN is doing something terrible, but there is a real question. And I think even some members of the Security Council, the UK comes to mind, they came out and said the UN peacekeeping needs to be much clearer. Its focus must be, it shouldn't be participating in creating displaced people.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And in this case, they have. But maybe it's like you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. But the problem is, again, like Somalia.
There are just a number, at least in that region, there are a number of displaced people. You have the Hutus who fled after they were defeated by the Tutsis from Rwanda, fled there, and there's a number of people who don't speak the local language, who are just kind of in displaced person camps, the festering, of insurgency, and it's a pretty, you don't want to say it's intractable, but it's a very difficult conflict.
But it also, I guess I almost go back to politics. It's sort of like first do no harm. You know what I mean? In this case, in the current situation in North Kivu, it raises the question of whether the UN erred, because when two, maybe it's not a question of intractable. Many things, there's a lot of chaos, but before you actually start carrying guns to people. You better make sure that they're respecting human rights, or at least fighting the right group. And it seems like in this case, and the question is, it's not clear what accountability there's going to be. The current special representative to the Democratic Republic of the Congo is an American guy, William Lacey Swing. He's retiring. A new guy is coming in, so it's sort of like, who made this decision? Again, it's not to blame anyone. It's just to say it's worked out. I will say it's pretty much, most people agree it's worked out quite badly.
I think as evidenced by the conflict there. Number 10 and final topic. Ban Ki-moon, 1 year at the job. So Secretary Generals are selected essentially by the Security Council, then voted on in almost a pro forma vote by the General Assembly. And so essentially the Secretary General is selected by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, and if any one of those members, for any reason at all, has a reason to want to not select a person, that person will not be Secretary General. Last year, after many sort of late rounds of voting, Ban Ki-moon sort of secured the favor of all 5 Security Council members, or at least was not objected to by all 5 Security Council members, and took the job on January 1st, 2007. And so now this is 1 year at the job. And my initial reaction, at least, is to me it seems that we alluded to this earlier, that Ban Ki-moon has injected sort of climate change into nearly every aspect of the UN's business. It was said that Kofi Annan was the Human Rights Secretary General, and that during his 10 years as Secretary General, human rights issues permeated every far-reaching agency of the UN. Now it seems that Ban Ki-moon is making climate change his signature issue, and I think, to his credit. Would you agree?
Yeah, he certainly he named two major issues, which were Darfur and climate change.
Yeah,
and it's true, and he's really made that.
Yeah.
I guess he'd also said when he came in, he'd said things like he's going to be a very transparent manager. It's time to highest ethical standards. I think there have been people, not to say there's been if anything, I think many people would say transparency has gone backwards at the UN so far. I hate to say it. From the top, it doesn't. It seems there's a kind of a, and I say it. My thinking on it has evolved. I mean, I think he's trying. He's trying hard, and he works long hours. That I'll say. I know the people that work here recently passed a resolution talking about nepotism, talking about a variety of issues. So there again, maybe the working man is unhappy everywhere, but it's I think that initially things got off on a foot where it was unclear who was really being hired as advisors. There were a lot of issues of how many people from the South Korean mission were coming to work here. Rather than just say, here they are, they put up an enormous smokescreen of who was hired and who was where. And in fact, that story ended up panning out. I mean, go ahead, you tell me.
The big question, I know it seems to me that a lot of the reforms, the transparency and management reforms that were pushed for, I think rightfully by the United States and most of Western Europe and most of the large funders of the UN, were reforms that essentially gave the Secretary General more power to hire and fire people as he pleases, which I think it makes sense because you want your top guy, your CEO, to have a team he trusts and supports, and that support him. Now, because the UN is an organization that purports to represent all member states around the world, that's a little difficult, and a lot of member states from the poorer states in the South, the global South, thought that this might be a power grab. And now it seems like sort of hard to have it both ways.
No, I'm not. At least personally, I'm not trying to have it either way. But I'm just saying it's not so. I guess I'm just saying there is a growing. Rather than try to say here's what I think of Ban Ki-moon after the end of the year, I'll say for what it's worth, we're having our discussion on what may be to some people the last working day of the UN year. It's the 21st, and they're still talking about the budget even now at late at night, 9 p.m. or so. Yeah. And there's a lot of critique among
happens every. That's right. The UN budget is decided biennially.
But there was I think that there had been a hope on some of the and included probably on the U.S. part, but even other countries that sort of it wouldn't be done in a kind of a slapdash way where like 2 days.
But it seems to happen sort of every 2 years. It always seems to come down to the 11th hour.
No, there's definitely brinksmanship. But I guess again, I don't know how to say overall. I think that he's trying hard, but on many fronts.
Here's a question for you. How would you compare his style to that of his predecessor, Kofi Annan?
Yeah, I think with all due respect to Mr. Ban, he's clearly in part it's a language thing, in part it's a style thing. I think he's a much less sort of like iconic, at the helm of the UN. And with Kofi Annan, whatever people thought of him,
I have to interrupt you right there. I think he's not iconic because he's only been at the UN for 1 year.
Right.
Kofi Annan was Kofi Annan after
he grew.
10
years.
You're absolutely not after the first.
I guess you're right, but I guess we'll choose like one example, and again, and I think it may actually symbolize, for better and worse, his style in trying to solve the Darfur problem. There's this issue of a major Sudanese government official, Ahmed Haroun, who was indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court.
Yes.
So most human rights, Kofi Annan. Most human rights advocates are saying the UN should be more vocal on that. But Ban Ki-moon went and met with Bashir. Afterwards, the press asked, "Did you raise this issue?" And there really was no answer. Now, the idea, and again, I'm saying for better or worse, his idea seems to be things can be worked out behind closed doors. That if you establish sort of personal relationships, and so to do that, but he doesn't come out and say human rights are taking a back seat, but they are taking a back seat.
Well, so he was formerly the foreign minister of South Korea, and he said straight up when he was Secretary General in his first sort of announcement, he says I do things a little differently. I'm like you said, he negotiates behind closed doors and tries to develop, I think, individual rapports with world leaders. I think to perhaps to varying degrees of success, but I think. I think one sort of instance of success, I think, was when he met with Gaddafi, and Gaddafi has all of a sudden played more of a constructive role in Darfur. I think on climate change, this is, like I said, it's been his signature issue, and I think he's certainly leaned on sort of, he's now friends with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Al Gore, and I think it's pretty stunning that he himself intervened and unexpectedly stayed later than he meant to in Bali. And I think did a lot of behind the closed doors arm twisting to make this deal happen.
Right. I mean, I feel like, for example, even on the Gaddafi thing, I think that's actually more a product of Gaddafi. Obviously, a payment was made for the Lockerbie shoot down. I mean, he was in France and with Sarkozy. It was in Gaddafi's interest to be seen as a peace broker on Darfur. And in fact, but from people that went to these talks in Sirte, Libya. In fact, when they got here, Gaddafi's speech was saying, "This is not an international problem. You international troublemakers should go home." And it wasn't the distance between being, offering a venue and actually. So I guess I would almost. And another example would be, and some of this is just inattention. A very simple UN issue, but there's always been this thing called the Office of the Special Advisor on Africa. It's had an Undersecretary General. It's sort of, whether you view it as patronage or not, this has been sort of like the continent of Africa feels that it's acted on by the UN system. For example, 75% of peacekeeping missions are there, and yet Africa doesn't have a permanent Security Council seat. And so this was always viewed, for better or worse, as something important. It's something that Ban Ki-moon, about halfway through the year, said he's going to eliminate the position or not fill it. This has led to rancor throughout the year, and you sit back and you scratch your head and you say, it's not like Ban Ki-moon is all about money saving, because as the U.S. has said...
I don't know. Then the flip side, you have all these arguments, the UN is so wasteful, they have all these
offices that I guess I'd say it seems very strange to have
do something about it.
I think most people analyzed that here and said... in fact, it had even the U.S. wasn't supportive of that cut. It just was kind of inattention. I think I guess what I'm trying to conclude with is exactly what you said. He's only been in for a year. Maybe he's going to learn how to... That was not really it wasn't really a fight worth having, and the current budget reinstates and says he must name somebody to the post. So it created a lot of ill will for no... But I think... Go ahead.
Sorry, I think just a clear distinction between Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon is that Kofi Annan sort of was a career UN employee. So he knew the bureaucracy, I think, in and out in a way that Ban Ki-moon, as an outsider, did not. And of course, you have that brings its advantages and its disadvantages, and clearly, not knowing every intricacy of the bureaucracy is difficult, and it makes your job all that harder. But it also, you bring in a separate perspective, I think, as well. So it has its pluses and its minuses.
I think he has a lot. I guess to sort of, in terms of like what to look for in 2008. He at least. I mean, it seems that he has the promise of sort of transparency, being a good manager, cracking down on. There was an issue around whistleblowers. This also may not have reached out there, but where he initially took a position that, well, if UN staff come forward to report problems, they should be protected, and all by the central office. And that sort of petered. It all sort of petered out. The Lockheed contract. I hate to say, not to be Johnny One Note. It was promised to have transparency, and there's been none. No documents released. Absolutely zero. So I think on that, and on probably more importantly, sort of staking out maybe he likes to go up behind closed doors, but it's widely perceived by many countries represented at the UN that he's too close to the U.S. And this is, you mentioned John Bolton before. I don't want to promote his book. John Bolton, and no one's denied this quotes Condoleezza Rice as saying, yes, we can support Ban Ki-moon because we really don't want somebody kind of either too flashy. Essentially, we want a weak SG. And Bolton came here, and I asked him, "Well, what about the quote?" And he says he goes further. He said, "Well, we didn't want somebody who thinks he's God's gift to humanity every morning." But I think it's not a question of whether he feels he's a big man. But I think in 2008, I don't know what issue it'll be. He has to think through. And he doesn't have to do anything. But I think that's going to put him on a much stronger. And it's not that he has to be anti-U.S. It's just that's a perception that I think needs to be needs to.
It's just funny that it just seems that the world at large, at least the United States at large, seems to think that the UN as being this sort of anti-American institution, whereas
ridiculous.
It's inside the UN.
Right.
Ban Ki-moon is seen sort of blatantly pro-American.
I don't think it's just inside the UN, though. I think
and it's not even. It could be objectively the case, and I think. I always try to make the case that I think the UN itself, its very existence, is a boon to American interests in sort of variety of ways, from supporting peacekeeping to places where the U.S. is understandably reluctant to send troops, to providing forums to try war criminals, to its work on refugees, and the very existence of the Security Council are all just significant boons to American interests. Well, and any final closing thoughts? I think we've been going.
No. I mean, I think obviously it doesn't. The calendar makes this a clean cutoff point, but I'll say over here, there's no cutoff. It's
So let's go. So to 2008. We'll see.
All right.
After the New Year.
Okay.
Happy New Year, Matthew. Thanks.
Excellent. No, very good.
All right.
Okay.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.